Thank you for taking the time out of your day to visit my channel Just All in One Resource. My name is Michael Slaunwhite, and I will be your host for today's story. This story will sound a wee bit familiar to some of you folks out there who play PC games. I decided to see how a story could be written to reflect one of my all-time favorite games called Fear Equation, created by Screwfly Studios. So, let's get on with the story. There is no set time period, so it could have happened 100 years ago, or sometime in the future. You can decide. So please sit back, and I hope you enjoy the story. The train was moving slowly but steadily through the dense fog that blanketed the countryside. The engineer's eyes were fixed on the tracks ahead, his hands gripping the controls tightly. He knew that the fog was unpredictable and dangerous, and that any misstep could mean the end for him and the survivors on board. As the train chugged along, the passengers huddled in the cars behind him, their faces etched with fear and anxiety. They knew that the fog was the main threat in this world, that it had the power to create terrifying nightmares and hallucinations that could drive a person insane. But they also knew that they had to keep moving, to find a way to survive in a world that had been turned upside down. The engineer glanced at the monitors in front of him, checking the status of the defenses that had been erected around the train cars. The barricades were holding for now, and the turrets were scanning the fog for any signs of danger. But he knew that they couldn't let their guard down, that the fog could strike at any moment and tear their defenses apart. The survivors were doing their best to keep busy, to distract themselves from the constant fear and uncertainty that plagued them. Some were playing cards or board games, while others were tending to the wounded or scavenging for supplies in the nearby towns and cities. But even as they went about their tasks, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time, that the fog would eventually overwhelm them and plunge them into darkness forever. As the train rolled on, the engineer couldn't help but wonder if they would ever find a way out of this nightmare, if they would ever be able to leave the fog behind and start anew. But for now, all they could do was keep moving, keep fighting, and hope that they would survive another day in a world where fear was the only equation that mattered. As the train made its way through the thick fog, the survivors' nerves were on edge. They had been on this journey for what felt like an interminable amount of time, and the constant fear and uncertainty had taken its toll on each and every one of them. It was Samantha who finally spoke up, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the train car. "I can't take it anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The constant fear, the nightmares, it's too much. We need to find a way out of this fog, and soon." The others nodded in agreement, but no one spoke up. They all knew that finding a way out of the fog was easier said than done, that they were trapped in this nightmare with no clear way out. But then, an unexpected sound cut through the stillness. It was a voice, crackling through a walkie-talkie. "Hello, is anyone there?" The survivors looked at each other, surprised and hopeful. Maybe they weren't alone in this fog after all. The survivors huddled around the walkie-talkie, listening intently to the voice on the other end. They had been traveling through the fog for what seemed like an endless amount of time, and the prospect of finding other survivors was both terrifying and exhilarating. The voice on the walkie-talkie introduced himself as Alex, and explained that he was part of a group of survivors who had established a fortified base in an old abandoned factory. He offered to guide the survivors to their base and provide them with shelter, food, and protection. The survivors made their way cautiously through the dense fog, following Alex's instructions as he guided them towards the old abandoned factory. The walkie-talkie crackled with static, making it difficult to hear, but the survivors could hear enough to follow the instructions. As they drew closer, they could see the outline of the factory through the fog. It loomed large and imposing, with broken windows and rusted metal beams jutting out at odd angles. It seemed like an unlikely place to find safety, but the survivors were desperate. Alex met them at the entrance, leading them through a maze of dimly lit corridors and up a rickety staircase to a large room filled with makeshift beds and supplies. The other survivors welcomed them warmly, sharing their food and telling stories of their own harrowing experiences in the fog. For a moment, it seemed like they had found a temporary reprieve from the dangers outside. But as the night wore on, strange sounds echoed through the factory, and the survivors couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The survivors spoke in whispers as they decided not to stay at the factory and returned to the safety of the train. Something seemed off about this place. They have heard of a group of people who were immune to the effects of the fog and purged everyone they came across. As the other people fell asleep, the survivors quietly rose from their cots and left the factory. When they reached the outside, the fog moved in even thicker than before, and they had to hurry to the train. They saw the train in the distance. They all picked up speed, looking everywhere around them, making sure no one was following them. One of the survivors fell behind, and they could hear her screaming. They all stopped and looked back, but she was no longer there. They knew the fog had taken her. The rest of the survivors knew it would be them next if they didn't hurry, so they began to run with everything they had. They finally reached the train, leaped in through the carriage door, and slammed it shut. They called out frantically to the engineer to get moving, and the engineer slammed the throttle into its full position. The train's wheels started to turn, trying to gain traction, and as it did so, the wheels screeched loudly, and the train began lurching forward, pushing the survivors backward onto the floor. The engineer knew that wasting fuel at this rate could cause some major issues down the road, but he didn't have a choice. Later that evening, as everyone fell asleep, the dreams came with a vengeance, twisting their thoughts and causing them to question what was real and what was not. Early the next morning, the engineer pulled the train into what looked like a small town dotted with a few buildings here and there. As the train shuddered to a stop, the survivors woke up. Jack pulled up the shade to look outside. From the looks of it, the fog had returned, and that they had to be extra cautious. As they made their way outside of the train car, they noticed that the air was thick with a strange energy. The fog always felt like it was alive. It twisted around their bodies as they walked silently into the small town, hoping to find some fuel and other supplies. The survivors began searching the buildings two by two. As they were making their way back to the train, they heard a strange noise coming from the mist. It sounded like footsteps, but not quite like any footsteps they had ever heard before. As Jack was about to open the train car door, they saw a figure emerging from the fog. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but there was something off about him. His eyes were dark and hollow, and he seemed to be moving in an unnatural way. The figure came closer and closer, until it was right in front of them. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished into the mist. The survivors stood there for a few moments. Jack opened the car door and ushered everyone inside, and locked it behind him. As everyone was busy going through the supplies they collected and placing them into storage, Jack slid the protective blind open and peered outside. He noticed dark figures walking amidst the fog, but none of them tried to approach the train. The survivors spent the next few hours fortifying their train car, setting up barricades and placing traps around it. They knew the fog would come soon, bringing with it the nightmares that tormented their minds. As they worked, they talked about their lives before the fog and how they ended up on this train. Sarah, a former nurse, had been at the hospital when the fog hit. She had tried to help the patients, but the nightmares had overwhelmed her and she had fled, joining a group of survivors she met along the way. Jack, a former police officer, had been on duty when the fog rolled into his town. He had seen firsthand the terror it brought with it, and had quickly realized that his best chance for survival was to get as far away as possible. He had come across the train and the group of survivors just in time. Maya, a young college student, had been on her way home for spring break when the fog hit. She had been separated from her family and friends, and had been wandering alone for days before finding the train. As they talked, they heard a faint sound in the distance. It sounded like a train whistle. They looked at each other in surprise. Could it be another train, filled with survivors like them, or was it something far more sinister? As the group continued on their journey through the fog, they couldn't help but notice the eerie silence that surrounded them. The engineer pulled into a very small village which appeared to only have 2 buildings. As he pulled back on the throttle, the train slowed and came to a stop. He alerted the survivors to begin scavenging for more fuel, food, and much-needed medical supplies. He asked him to concentrate on those items so they could continue on their journey. The survivors unloaded their wheelbarrows from the train and started making their way toward the first building on the left. Suddenly, a low growling sound floated through the fog, breaking the silence, causing the group to stop and look nervously around them, trying to locate the source of the noise. As they searched, the growling grew louder and more intense. Then, out of the fog emerged a hungry-looking wolf. Jack whispered, "I guess the fog doesn't affect animals." The survivors quickly realized that they were no match for the wolf and began to run for their lives. Everyone scattered, running into the buildings, leaving Jack of the group behind. The wolf circled the man, slowly looking for a way to make a quick kill. Just as the wolf was about to strike, one of the survivors burst out of the fog with a crowbar, screaming, and struck the wolf in the back of the head, making the wolf fall to the ground. The wolf tried to get up when Jack struck the wolf's head with the heel of his boot. The survivor who burst from the fog asked, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm okay. I owe you one." The man answered with a grin, "Yes, I suppose you do." Jack yelled for the survivors to come out, and they grabbed the wheelbarrows, and they soon got down to searching the buildings for supplies. Once their search was complete, it was surprising to see that every wheelbarrow was overflowing with supplies. They soon reached the train, and Jack took what fuel they found and poured its content into the train fuel tanks, shut the lid, and walked back towards the group as they were unloading the supplies into the car, and jumped in. Jack pulled the mic from its hook and radioed his report that this haul should be good for a while, and that he topped off the fuel tanks. The engineer pushed the throttle forward, and the train began chugging away slowly. The engineer was happy to be moving again. The longer they stayed, the more the fog would increase, which would put all of them in mortal danger. A faint smile crossed the engineer's face, and he gently patted the gear column and whispered to himself, "That a girl." As the train made its way through the fog, the survivors could sense a growing tension among them. They had been traveling for days without any sign of civilization, and the endless fog was beginning to take its toll. Suddenly, the train lurched to a halt, throwing everyone off balance. The survivors looked at each other in confusion, wondering what could have caused the train to stop so abruptly. As they gathered their wits, they heard a faint whispering sound coming from outside the train. It was almost as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with them. The survivors cautiously made their way to the nearest window, peering through the fog to see what was causing the noise. To their horror, they saw a group of shadowy figures moving in the distance, their forms distorted by the thick fog. As the figures drew closer, the survivors could see that they were no longer human, but rather twisted, nightmarish creatures that seemed to be made entirely of the fog itself. The survivors huddled together, realizing that they were facing a threat unlike anything they had ever seen before. As the creatures closed in on the train, the survivors prepared to make their stand, determined to survive at any cost. After a few minutes, nothing happened. They all returned to the window. As they looked outside, they noticed once the figures touched the side of the train, they disappeared, leaving behind a swirling dark mist which was swallowed by the fog. Sarah said, "I guess our defenses are working. They couldn't get in. Looks like it." "That's good to know," answered Jack. After a few moments, the engineer put the train into gear, and they began moving once again. The group had been traveling through the fog for what felt like days, with no signs of reaching their destination. Supplies were running low and tensions were high. They had managed to avoid any major attacks from the fog's creatures, but they knew that it was only a matter of time before they would face a major threat. As they continued on their journey, they stumbled upon an abandoned town with empty buildings and streets, but it offered a glimmer of hope for their dire situation. They cautiously made their way into the town, searching for any supplies that could help them on their journey. As they searched through the empty buildings, they came across a strange device. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, with wires and tubes running through it. They had no idea what it was or how it worked, but they knew that it could be important. Just as they were about to leave the town, they heard a noise coming from one of the buildings. They cautiously made their way towards the source of the sound, ready to defend themselves if necessary. As they entered the building, they were shocked to find a group of survivors huddled in the corner. They were malnourished and weak, but they were alive. The group realized that they could not leave these survivors behind and decided to bring them along on their journey. With their new companions in tow, the train began to lurch forward, and they were on their way once more. The survivors all looked at each other with pleased expressions. A few decided to play a game of Monopoly while others started to repair their defenses. "We need to find a permanent solution," said Emma, breaking the silence. "We can't keep doing this forever." The rest of the group nodded in agreement, knowing she was right. But finding a permanent solution in a world where the fog and its nightmares reign seemed like an impossible task. "I heard of a place," said Charlie, speaking up for the first time in a while. "It's a military research facility, and they were working on something that could potentially stop the fog." The group looked at Charlie, intrigued. "Where is this place?" asked Emma. "It's a few days' journey from here. But I think it's worth checking out. We can't keep living in fear like this." The group agreed, and they set out on their journey to the military research facility, hoping that they might find a way to end the nightmare once and for all. As they traveled, the dreams began changing into things which twisted their minds, and many woke up screaming. Everyone woke up once the screaming began, which scared them all to death. Each one who had the nightmares began describing what they experienced. Once they all finished describing the dreams, it was decided they needed to build stronger defenses against the fog, and what comes with it. Finally, after days of travel, they arrived at the facility. It was dark, quiet, and ominous. But they pressed on, determined to find the answers they were looking for. They searched the facility, finding clues and information that led them to a room with a large, mysterious machine. "This must be it," said Charlie, looking at the machine in awe. The group worked together, trying to figure out how to activate the machine. After several attempts, they finally succeeded, and the machine hummed to life. The survivors didn't have to wait long. The turrets which the survivors didn't see suddenly activated, and scanned the room looking for movement. Everyone stood still. Everyone knew that movement from any of them could end in them being cut down where they stood. As each of them stood still, they began to notice the fog getting thicker inside the facility. Either they died from the fog, or killed by the turrets. It didn't matter in the end, it just meant they would not be leaving the facility alive. As Jack was trying to figure a way out of this mess, dark figures began to form out the fog. Suddenly the turrets immediately targeted them, and began firing. The brass casings were being ejected as quickly as the bullets tore through the fog. The shell casings hitting the floor made a horrible noise which made some of the survivors cover their ears. Suddenly the turrets one by one began to stop firing, and all that could be heard is the wild clicking of the turret's hammer. The dark shapes turned and stared at the survivors. After a few moments they began floating toward them. Jack yelled, "Back to the train." Charlie asked, "What about the device?" "Leave the thing here, and get moving," said Jack as he pushed Charlie hard to get him moving. As the survivors were running, Dark shapes began to appear out of the mist which started floating toward them. Jack kept screaming for the survivors ahead of him to run harder. As they reached the train, Jack looked back and noticed 3 survivors were lagging behind, and just before he could run to lend them a hand, he watched as the dark figures reached them. He noticed the dark figures just standing there, enveloping the doomed survivors. As they did this, the survivors' bodies melted away, leaving their skeletons on the concrete platform, which then crumbled into dust and was absorbed by the fog, leaving nothing behind. As the engineer started the train, some of survivors broke down in tears, sobbing. They were all spent and exhausted. Once they all calmed down, they had a small meal and decided to go to sleep. As they all woke up to start their daily routines, starting with a meager breakfast, Jack told them what he saw happen to the other survivors who were too slow to make it. You can hear some of the survivors whispering, "My God." As they finished their meal and began repairing and strengthening the train car's defenses, the engineer radioed the survivors that they were coming to a dual track system, and they may feel a small bump along the way, and to hold on. Just as soon as he finished speaking the words, the train swayed back and forth as it switched to the far right track. The rest of the day and night was uneventful. No one had any bad dreams, and things started to feel a little less tense. Jack decided to go up front and sit with the engineer for a while. As Jack walked through the car door into the engine compartment, he noticed the engineer polishing the engine levers and the control panels, just like he used to do to his old Oldsmobile on Saturday mornings. "How are things?" asked Jack. "Not bad so far. We will be needing more fuel soon," replied the engineer. "I'll put it on my list." As they both stood near the controls talking about everything under the sun, the engineer noticed something off in the distance. At first it looked like a dim headlamp, and as he continued to stare at the light, it became brighter. He motioned for Jack to take a quick look before yelling for him to get back into the train car and tell everyone to get down. As Jack was running back to the car, he could hear the engineer give out a curse while he slammed the regulator as far as it could go. Immediately the train began picking up speed. Soon both trains were screaming past each other at an unimaginable speed. The other train turrets began firing. The survivors were all face down while bullets raked the side of their car. Armor-piercing rounds penetrated, leaving smoking holes as they passed through. Suddenly they all heard a noise which sounded like a foo-womp. One of the survivors knew what that sound was and yelled to everyone to stay down, that they fired an RPG toward them and brace for impact. The RPG hit the car directly behind theirs, and as the back door exploded open, they all watched in horror as the car behind them and every car after it exploded in a shower of sparks and heaved the entire train off of the tracks. Their train car leaped off the tracks, but because the engine was barreling at full throttle and was much heavier than their train car, it kept them from being derailed like the others. The survivors were being tossed around the cabin as their car lurched back and forth violently, and finally settling down. The survivors, still hugging the floor of their car for dear life, noticed that the train which passed them began slamming into the debris left by the other derailed cars at an incredible speed, which forced it to come to a sudden violent stop. After a few minutes they noticed their train was coming to a rolling stop, and an awful grinding sound could be heard. All of a sudden it became quiet. All that could be heard was the creaking of the train as it was settling down from all of the damage it took. All of the survivors stepped out of the train and noticed the engineer scratching his head as he was muttering under his breath. Jack asked what happened. "One of their rounds did some damage, but to what I don't know," replied the engineer, still scratching his head. "Well, I best get to it then." Charles volunteered to help as the rest of the survivors began repairing the damage to their car. As hours passed, Jack would periodically keep a close eye on the other train to make sure no one was approaching and keep tabs on how thick the fog was. Once the repairs were finished on their car, they went inside to start cleaning up what was tossed around and take stock of their supplies. After a while, they let Jack know, and he was relieved to find out everything remained intact. As it stands, he noted they have enough fuel, food, and medical supplies to last a few more weeks. Jack raised his head and looked over to see Sarah tending to the survivors' needs. A few were hurt, but overall they all felt fortunate to have gotten through the battle. Jack walked up to Charles and the engineer, and he was told that they would have the train moving again in a couple of hours, maybe less if there were no other damages they haven't come across yet. The group huddled together in the cramped train car. Outside, they all noticed the fog getting thicker. Some of the survivors began seeing shadows appearing and disappearing, but they all knew the thicker the fog, the stronger it gets, which means it won't be long before they will be attacked. Jack soon noticed the fog was thicker and started to swirl with a life of its own. He ran over to Charles and the engineer, asking them to hurry. As they were in a rushed conversation, they began hearing screams coming from the direction of the train further down the track. It seems the fog is devouring those who survived the crash. The fog became much thicker, which twisted around the derailed train, and then started moving toward them. "Come on guys," yelled Jack, "we have to get moving." The engineer jumped back into the cab and started the engines, then motioned Jack and Charles to get inside. The engineer pushed the throttle forward, and as he did, the wheels began to turn rapidly until they gripped the rail, which made the train lunge forward. Soon the train was back on the move again. As the train was leaving the scene, they could still hear the screams of the men left behind. They had been traveling for months, constantly on the move in search of supplies. The dreams that the fog created were becoming more frequent and more vivid, haunting them even when they were awake. One night, as they settled in for another fitful sleep, they heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like something scratching against the metal walls of the train car. They tensed up, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, a hand burst through the wall, grabbing one of the survivors and dragging him into the fog-filled abyss. The rest of the group screamed in terror as they heard his desperate cries for help. They knew that they had to be even more vigilant now. The fog was not just a faceless threat, but a relentless force that would stop at nothing to consume them. They had to stick together and fight for survival, no matter what happens. The engineer looked on his map and noticed a rail yard just ahead, about 2 kilometers away, so he decided to stop there to see if they need anything. As the train came to a stop, the survivors decided to get out and stretch their legs for a bit. As the survivors walked around keeping a close eye on things, they heard a faint sound in the distance. It was a person's voice. Then the voice got louder, crying for help. They hesitated at first, unsure if it was a trap or a genuine cry for assistance. But the voice grew louder and more desperate, and they knew they had to investigate. They followed the sound to an abandoned train car, where they found a lone survivor huddled inside. She was badly injured and barely conscious. Jack lifted her up and began carrying her to their train car and gently placed her in his bed. Sarah began immediately tending to her wounds. After a few hours, the woman appeared to be no longer in pain, and Sarah helped her drink some water. She soon fell back to sleep without any issues. Meanwhile, Jack and a few of the other survivors were out scavenging for supplies. They were in need of fuel. Soon the engineer noticed them approaching the train with their wheelbarrow filled with fuel jugs, which they quickly poured into the main tanks of the engine. All topped off, Jack said as he strolled back to the car. "Good to know," replied the engineer. As they all got back on board, the engineer started the engines, and they were soon on their way. After a few hours, the engineer noticed that the fog was getting thicker, but that had to be impossible. The fog never traveled west to east, it's always been east to west. He went to his map to check which way the track was heading. "Damn," muttered the engineer. "We're heading east before turning back west again." He radioed Jack and told him to get ready. The engineer explained what was happening, and the survivors frantically began reinforcing the barricades. If they don't get this done before they reach the thickest part of the fog, none of them will make it out alive. The fog began closing in around them, thick and impenetrable. Jack could feel the dream creatures pressing in on all sides, their presence a cold, suffocating weight. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. "Get ready to defend the car," Jack said, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "We can't let them get inside." The survivors scrambled to their stations, grabbing weapons and preparing to fight. Jack stood at the front of the car, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a creature lunged out of the fog, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Jack reacted quickly, swinging his weapon with all his strength. The creature let out a piercing screech and crumpled to the floor. But there were more coming, and Jack knew that they wouldn't be able to hold them off forever. He gritted his teeth, determined to protect the survivors at all costs. The battle raged on for the rest of the day. When it was over, the survivors were battered and exhausted. Jack leaned against the wall, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked around at the survivors, feeling a sense of pride and gratitude. But he knew that they couldn't let their guard down. The fog was still out there, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And they had to be ready for it. As the train pulled into a station, they were greeted by a dense fog that engulfed the area. The train car hissed and creaked as it slowly came to a halt, and the group stepped out into the unknown. Glimpses of shadows could be seen within the fog, and the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. The survivors moved cautiously, their eyes and ears alert for any sign of danger. Suddenly, one of the survivors spotted movement in the fog. It was a figure, walking towards them. The group tensed up, ready to fight or flee. As the figure emerged from the fog, they could see that it was a woman. She was disheveled and looked scared. She begged for their help, telling them that she had been wandering the fog for days, unable to find her way out. The group decided to take her with them, hoping that she could provide some insight into the fog. They continued their journey, with the woman in tow. As they walked deeper into the fog, the dreams started to set in. Each survivor experienced their own terrifying nightmare, and it became clear that the fog was trying to break them down. Pushing through the dreams and the fog, determined to find a way out, the woman they had found proved to be a valuable asset, as she had some knowledge about the fog and its effects. As they approached what seemed to be the end of the fog, they were met with a strange sight. In the distance, they could see a group of figures, dressed in white robes and chanting in a language they didn't understand. The survivors knew that they had to be careful. They cautiously approached the group, weapons at the ready. But as they got closer, they realized that the figures were not human at all. They were some sort of strange, otherworldly beings that had been conjured by the fog. The survivors fought for their lives, using every weapon at their disposal to defeat the creatures. It was a hard-fought battle, but eventually they emerged victorious. As they looked around at the aftermath, the survivors knew that they had made it out of the fog. But they also knew that they would never forget the horrors they had experienced within it. A few hours later, the engineer seen the group stumble out of the fog toward the train. The engineer knew something was off, and ran to help them get back into the car. He pushed the last survivor inside, and slammed the door shut. He quickly got inside, and started the engine. The train took a bit to get moving, but it finally got its footing, and it began moving forward. As the train car rumbled on, the survivors huddled together, trying to stay warm and ward off the bone-chilling cold that seeped in from the outside. They had been traveling for what felt like months, but they had no way of knowing how far they had come or how much further they had to go. Suddenly, a loud banging sound echoed through the car, causing everyone to jump. They looked around nervously, trying to locate the source of the noise. After a moment, they realized that it was coming from outside. One of the survivors cautiously made their way to the door and peeked outside. What they saw made their blood run cold. A group of strange, twisted creatures were clawing at the sides of the train car, trying to break their way in. The survivors sprang into action, grabbing their weapons and prepared to defend themselves. The creatures were pounding on the sides of the car with unnatural strength. As the survivors fought for their lives, one of them noticed something strange happening to the fog outside. It seemed to be shifting and swirling in an unnatural way. Suddenly, a deafening roar shook the train car, causing everyone to stumble. When they looked outside, they saw that the creatures had vanished, and the fog had dissipated as well. Confused and shaken, the survivors gathered together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. They knew that the fog was a powerful force, but they had never seen it manifest in such a terrifying way before. As they settled back into their makeshift beds, the survivors couldn't help but wonder what other horrors the fog had in store for them. As the train car rolled through the fog, the survivors huddled together, their nerves frayed by the constant threat of the unknown. Suddenly, the train jolted and screeched to a halt, causing everyone to stumble. "What the hell was that?" shouted one of the survivors, a burly man with a thick beard. "I don't know," replied Jack, his voice tinged with panic. The radio crackled to life. The engineer told Jack that something is blocking the tracks. The survivors peered out the windows, but the thick fog obscured their vision. Suddenly, they heard a low rumbling sound, growing louder by the second. "Get ready," shouted the bearded man. "Something's coming." The rumbling grew into a deafening roar as a massive shape emerged from the fog. It was a towering monster, at least 20 feet tall, with limbs like tree trunks and glowing red eyes. The survivors scrambled for cover as the monster charged towards them. It swung its massive arms, smashing into the top of the train, forcing the ceiling to dent in. The survivors screamed in panic, fearing that they will be crushed. The survivors huddled as close as possible to the far end of the train car. As the monster loomed over them, its hot breath steaming in the cold air. But just as it was about to strike, the engineer switched on his overpowered train lights, which flooded the entire area and into the face of the creature, sending it reeling back into the fog. The survivors stumbled to their feet, dazed but alive. As they looked around at the destruction, they realized that they were now completely alone in the fog, with no idea where to go or what to do next. Jack and the other survivors jumped off the train. Sarah went to check on the lady in Jack's bed, but she must have died during the attack. She held her head low and said a silent prayer. Sarah let Jack know what happened, and Jack went inside and carried her outside. As Jack was passing the survivors, he asked one of them to grab a shovel. Jack stood for a moment facing a small wooded area and decided to bury her under an oak tree. Jack began digging the grave, making sure that it was deep enough to remove any chances of hungry animals finding her body. Meanwhile, Sarah wrapped her in the best linen she could find and picked a few flowers from the embankment and tucked them into the folds of the linen. Once the grave was finished, Jack and the others lowered her into the grave and covered her remains. They said a small blessing, then climbed back into the car and shut the door. The train began to lunge forward. They were once again on the move. As they trudged through the thick fog, they knew that they had no choice but to keep moving forward, towards whatever lay ahead. The group had been on the move for hours, and the fog showed no signs of letting up. They were all tired, hungry, and on edge. Every sound seemed to make them jump, and every shadow appeared to hide some unseen threat. Late one evening, just before everyone was about to go to bed, they suddenly heard a loud crash from the back of the train. They quickly ran to investigate and found that a section of the barricade had collapsed. The fog had seeped through and was beginning to fill the car. Without hesitation, they began repairing the barricade and strengthened the defenses. The fog continued to seep in, but they managed to hold it back, at least for the time being. Once they were sure that they were safe once more, they all retired for the night while Jack stood guard. As the train pushed forward, the group became more determined than ever to reach Sanctuary. As they continued their journey, the survivors encountered more and more obstacles. The fog seemed to be closing in on them faster than ever before, and they could feel its chilling presence creeping up on them. They had to keep moving, keep pushing forward, no matter how exhausted they were. The supplies they had gathered were running low, and they knew they needed to find a new source of food and water soon. One day, they stumbled upon a small town that seemed untouched by the fog. It was like an oasis in the midst of the chaos that surrounded them. They cautiously approached the town, hoping to find some much-needed supplies. Jack quickly had the survivors spread out and gather what they could find of use, and in a matter of a few hours they replenished their stock of fuel, food, and medical supplies. The group had been on the move for several days now, constantly pushing forward as they battled the fog and the nightmares it brought. They were exhausted, but the thought of finally reaching Sanctuary kept them going. At one point, they had to cross a rickety bridge over a deep gorge. It was a nerve-wracking experience, but they made it across safely. Despite the challenges, they were making progress. They could feel that they were getting closer to their goal. The thought of finally being safe and free from the fog's grasp gave them renewed energy. As they began eating their dinner, they talked about what they would do when they reached Sanctuary. Some wanted to start over and build a new community, while others just wanted to live out their days in peace. But for now, they had to focus on the journey ahead. They knew that they couldn't let their guard down for even a moment. They settled in for the night, hoping maybe tomorrow will be that day they arrive in Sanctuary. Early the next morning they all got up and did their normal chores for the day. As they peered out the window, they began to notice a change in the thickness of the fog. It was getting thinner and thinner, and they could see the sun beginning to rise on the horizon. This lifted their spirits and made him feel more hopeful. The fog still lingered around them, but they could see further than before. They could make out the shapes of trees and buildings in the distance. The survivors began to feel a glimmer of hope that they might actually reach their destination. As the train made its way around a steep bend, they saw off in the distance a station which didn't resemble anything they saw before. As the train pulled in and came to a stop, the survivors are amazed at the sight before them. The town is surrounded by lush greenery and tall mountains, with a clear blue sky above. The sun is shining down on them, its warmth comforting after the long journey through the fog. As they stepped off the train, they are greeted by a group of people who seem to have been expecting them. A small woman approached the survivors, who bowed slightly and said with a broad smile, "Welcome to Sanctuary." As they walk through the streets, they see children playing and people going about their daily lives. The survivors can't believe how lucky they are to have finally made it. They feel a sense of relief and gratitude, knowing that they are safe from the fog. The survivors are shown to their new homes, which are clean and comfortable. They are given food and water, and everything they need to start their new lives. The townspeople are warm and friendly, and the survivors feel like they have found a new family. As the sun sets on their first day in Sanctuary, the survivors gather together to share a meal and to talk about their experiences. They are grateful for each other, and for the chance to start anew. They feel that they have finally found a place where they belong, a place where they can live without fear. And so, as the survivors settle in for the night, they know that they have finally found their home. They know that they are safe, and that they can live without the eternal threat of the fog. They feel a sense of hope, knowing that they can build a new life for themselves in Sanctuary. As you watch Jack and the others walk down the street at night, someone suddenly turns a light on, showing the development team at Screwfly Studios standing around a 4x8 sheet of plywood covered in railroad tracks, styrofoam hills covered in green felt, with trees, rocks, and everything which is used to create a landscape of this type. As the two-man team stand with their friends around the table, they explain that their next game, called Fear Equation, would be something along these lines. And if anyone loses sight of what they are trying to do, just simply come here and look at the map. One of their friends speaks up. I don't think I have ever heard of a game like this before. Others nod their heads in agreement. As they went back to their cubicles, you can hear them furiously working, trying to bring this idea into reality. If you are at all interested in this game, you can get a copy on Steam or on GOG. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.